I'm delighted to be here, and this is such a magnificent facility. It's just incredible. I thought I would begin this evening talking a little bit about how I came to write a biography of Richard Henry Dana, and then take the liberty of describing an episode in Dana's life and the life of our country that you may find relevant to the challenges we face today. I wonder how many of you here have read Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast. So that's 4 or 5. Typically, folks at least my age. When I first decided I was going to write a book about Dana, I went to a literary agent in Boston, and I said, of course, everybody knows 2 Years Before the Mast, so I'm going to start with Dana's legal career, not about the book. And she looked at me and said, I had sent the proposal on before I met with her. She said, well, I did a survey of our office. We have 12 very smart people here. Not one of them ever heard of the book. And she said, well, I thought it was fiction. So she said, maybe you ought to start with a book. And so that's how I'll start tonight. It was published in 1840. It's been in print since that time, never been out of print. Dana received $250 and 24 copies, which was $250 more than I received from Harvard, and 14 copies more than I received from Harvard. On the other hand, Harper Brothers got the copyright, which made their fortune. That really started Harper Brothers as a major publishing firm in New York. So Dana did not get the copyright, made no money from it at all. The book recounts his voyage as a common seaman aboard the brig Pilgrim to California in 1836, then a remote coast virtually unknown to Americans. Dana was a 19-year-old Harvard dropout. He was the eldest son of one of America's most distinguished families. The Danas had been in Massachusetts since 1640, just as long as their neighbors, the Adamses, who they were very closely linked with. So closely, in fact, that George Washington used the phrase Adams Dana as a password during the Revolutionary War. The book is a harrowing account of the voyage. Dana's friend Herman Melville said, the passage around Cape Horn must have been written with an icicle. And it's an invaluable description of California in 1836, where Dana and the Pilgrim's crew spent over a year and a half gathering cowhides from Mexican ranchers, which are then loaded on ship and sailed back to Boston for use in making shoes. It was literally the first guide to California. It was said that in 1849, during the California Gold Rush, the two essentials for prospectors were a pickaxe and Dana's book. But it's really the third element of 2 Years Before the Mast that had the greatest impact. Dana's chilling account of the floggings aboard ship by a sadistic captain who treated common sailors just as plantation owners treated slaves is one of the most famous passages in American literature. Dana was sickened by what he saw. The 20-year-old made himself a promise, thousands of miles from home and at the mercy of a cruel master and uncertain fate. I vowed that if God should ever give me the means, I would do something to redress the grievances and sufferings of that poor class of beings, of which I was then one. Slavish Shore is the story of how Dana tried to keep that vow in the face of the most exclusive and powerful establishment in America, the Boston Society in which he had been born and bred. My interest in learning the how was prompted by what seemed to me to be two contradictory portraits of Dana. The one so vivid in his book of young Dana's courage and integrity and sense of justice, so clearly part of his character, and the other most notably in The Education of Henry Adams, where we get a depiction of a fastidious aristocrat. I couldn't conceive how someone who wrote 2 Years Before the Mast could live comfortably in his own skin if he was merely another privileged son of the upper class who put the brutality he witnessed behind him to become a lawyer for the Boston aristocracy who were making their fortunes almost literally on the backs of sailors and slaves. It turns out Dana asked himself the same question. He began a journal in 1841 when he was 25 and kept it for nearly 20 years until the eve of the Civil War. It was a time, not unlike now, when Dana and America, and the America in which he lived, were compelled to ask itself, what price human dignity? The process of getting a manuscript approved by the Harvard University Press is interesting. To put it more accurately, as a colleague said to me about the process of becoming a federal judge, it would be interesting if it wasn't so traumatic. A manuscript must overcome several hurdles, one of which is responding to written critiques by anonymous scholars Harvard selects to read the manuscript. One such reader began a lengthy criticism of Slavish with the observation, "This is the work of an amateur historian." I doubted that was meant as a compliment, but I couldn't refute its accuracy. I had to defend in writing the book to an even larger anonymous group, the Harvard Board of Syndics. I don't know what that means either. But I had one advantage as an amateur. I wasn't writing the book as a published parish member of the faculty or the academy. I wished, of course, for Slavish Shore to be published. I'd put much work into it, and I thought the story needed to be told, but I didn't write it for Harvard. So I defended my amateur status with the strengths I believed I brought to a Dana biography. Much of Dana's life took place in forums, political, legislative, and judicial, in which I had some passing personal experience. As my wife Susan said when I was grappling with the narrative and about Dana's interaction with legislators and judges and lawyers and politicians, she said, "You've met all these people before." Then too, I had some familiarity with being in the midst of the social, political, and legal turmoil precipitated when a society confronts a deeply divisive issue, as it did in same-sex marriage. So I hasten to add, I'm comparing neither myself nor that issue to the enormous pressures upon Dana and the country when the passions, danger, and stakes were much higher. But when I found in the Massachusetts Historical Archives a note to Dana dated June 1851 purporting to be a friendly warning, I paid more attention to it than a professional historian might have. Dana was in the midst of defending fugitive slaves when the anonymous note writer expressed, quote, "the hope you will not take notice of the attacks upon you." When the same-sex marriage case was pending in Vermont, I became a bit of an expert in recognizing friendly warnings from anonymous sources. I didn't save them all, and I doubt Dana did. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls on white America to turn away from the brightly rendered version of your country, as it always has declared itself, and turn to something murkier and unknown. If I had to summarize what I learned in writing this book, it is that we Americans tell ourselves a better history than we deserve. Nowhere is this more true than the version most of us learned about Boston in the decade before the Civil War. The popular history is one of an unbroken line of anti-slavery action, from the prophetic abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison to the courageous Charles Sumner, literally fending off a Southerner's blows on the Senate floor, to the heroic Robert Gould Shaw, a fallen leader of the 54th Regiment, colored. In the words of one historian of Boston, Garrison was the voice, Shaw was the arm. Charles Francis Adams Jr., Dana's first biographer, had a different view of Boston in the decade before the Civil War. Social and business Boston was in its heart and almost avowedly a pro-slavery community, and so it remained until 1861. It was a time, said Ralph Waldo Emerson, when judges, bank presidents, railroad men, men of fashion, and lawyers universally all took the side of slavery. If you were taught the American history I was, you will remember Daniel Webster for his selfless sacrifice of his last chance to fulfill his presidential ambition. Indeed, Webster is one of JFK's profiles in courage for his famous 7th of March speech to the U.S. Senate, where Webster pretty dramatically declared his support for the Compromise of 1850. I speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause. It was, wrote Kennedy, the highest statesmanship, Webster's last great service to the nation. One might think so because Webster was 68 when he made the speech and would be 70 if he ran for president in 1852, the next presidential election. But if there's one thing all of us here know is that politicians do not lose their presidential ambitions at age 70. The sanitized version of Webster came well after the Civil War, when 20th century historians like Alan Nevins gave us a brightly rendered version of Daniel Webster that neatly covered up the hypocrisy of Boston's best people in the decade before the Civil War. Webster's 7th of March speech contained less soaring language than "hear me for my cause." Webster said, "To the South, slavery is no evil, no scourge, but a great religious, social, and moral blessing. All sober-minded men of the North who are not carried away with some fanatical idea have a constitutional duty to return slaves that have escaped to the free states." And with the declaration, "I will support a new fugitive slave law," Webster ensured its passage. Daniel Webster's 7th of March speech was a calculated political move that was intended to boost his political support in the South, and of even greater importance, to maintain his standing as the voice of Boston's most financial interests. The close economic affiliation between northern manufacturers of cotton goods and southern producers of cotton, between the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash, in Charles Sumner's famous formulation, led to a curious moral spectacle. The question Bostonians would face in the 1850s was whether to return men to slavery. There is no doubt where Boston Brahmins class stood. A slaveholder or his Harvard son were said by one observer to be Boston society's most sought-after guests. On July 9th, 1850, Senator Webster again made a dramatic announcement to the U.S. Senate. Webster interrupted a colleague. I am informed that the president is gravely ill and cannot live much longer." Webster was right. President Zachary Taylor died that evening. It was the second time within a decade that a Whig president had suddenly died, and the second time that he was succeeded by a mediocre vice president. It was a death that almost certainly altered our history for the worse. Zachary Taylor was far less accommodating of the Southern interests in the proposed Compromise of 1850 than the new president, Millard Fillmore, was to be, even though Taylor had been a slaveholder from Virginia and Fillmore was from New York. Within a matter of weeks, Boston and New York financial interests had persuaded Fillmore to nominate Daniel Webster Secretary of State. Webster agreed to accept the appointment only after assurances from Boston's merchant princes, the Lowells and the Cabots, the Appletons, the Lawrences, the list goes on, that they would continue to generously supplement his salary as they had always done. When Dana publicly asserted that a corrupt bargain existed between Daniel Webster and Boston's most influential men, the leading banker in Boston, Franklin Haven, defended the bribes, quote, "as gifts from Boston's honorable men to a great statesman who has made a great sacrifice of his financial interest." In Beacon Hill society, opposition to Webster was, said Charles Francis Adams, considered an outrage on decency. So here we have, in a deeply divided country, less than 2 years before a presidential election, the most powerful political figure in America seeking to advance his election prospects by securing financial support from those whose economic interests he has protected, and by mobilizing an electoral base on the promise that a law to send back those who are here illegally will be vigorously enforced. History does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. As Millard Fillmore's Secretary of State, Daniel Webster had the responsibility to direct federal marshals and U.S. attorneys. The Department of Justice was not established until after the Civil War, and he had the most authority ever provided to that office by virtue of the Fugitive Slave Law enacted when President Fillmore endorsed the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act empowered slave owners to secure the assistance of federal marshals to seize alleged fugitive slaves. The alleged fugitives were to be brought before a federal commissioner for a summary proceeding in which a certificate introduced by the slave owner was full and conclusive evidence of the fact of escape. The alleged fugitive slave could not testify. The writ of habeas corpus was not available. There was no right of appeal. It was a crime to hinder, obstruct the seizure of an alleged fugitive slave. It was a crime to aid, abet, assist, rescue, or conceal an alleged fugitive slave. Commissioners had the authority to command citizens to assist as a posse comitatus in the seizure of an alleged runaway slave. It was the most draconian statute ever enacted into American law. Daniel Webster believed if he could enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in Boston, he would be the next president of the United States. In October 1850, Dana appeared at Boston's Faneuil Hall, where he joined abolitionists, free soilers, and the Vigilance Committee, a group of lawyers opposed to the law. For abolitionists, the cause was ideological. Dana was not an abolitionist. He despised the use of authority to demean human dignity. When Dana exclaimed in 2 Years Before the Mast, his mortification at seeing a shipmate flogged, a human being, flogged like a beast, it was an expression of human sympathy from the core of his own humanity. Kenneth Clark, some here may remember him from the PBS series on Western civilization, said after a lifetime of its study, I am sure that human sympathy is more valuable than ideology. It was human sympathy, not political ideology, that I believe sustained Dana in the trials, legal and moral, that were about to befall him. In November 1850, Secretary of State Webster's first attempt to have federal marshals seize a fugitive slave in Boston failed. President Fillmore wrote a letter to the owner of the slave apologizing for the government's failure to secure his property. Webster organized a massive rally at Faneuil Hall to demonstrate support for vigorous enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Leader of the Boston Bar, Benjamin Curtis, I shall have more to say about him shortly, declared, fugitive slaves have no right to be here. In 1850, 35-year-old Richard Henry Dana had been practicing for 10 years. He had, much to the displeasure of Boston ship owners, been very successful in representing sailors denied their wages. Dana's father was soon to wonder why not a man of weight at the bar could not be found to assist his son, a young man with a large and growing family working like a slave to support it against the wealth and rank of this overwhelming city. But all that was very far from Dana's mind when on a Saturday morning in February 1851, he was working in his office next to the Boston courthouse. A lawyer rushed in to tell Dana that the U.S. Marshal had a fugitive in custody. Dana went immediately to the courthouse where he saw a good-looking black fellow surrounded by armed deputies. Shadrach Menkins was still wearing the waiter's apron he had on when he was seized from a Boston coffee house. Dana volunteered to represent Menkins and quickly prepared a petition, asserting that the Boston resident was imprisoned in the courthouse under the pretense he was a fugitive slave, and he did not know whether there was a warrant or not. Word spread rapidly in Boston's black community of the seizure. Dana noted that the crowd was increasing every minute. With petition in hand, Dana went in search of the one man who possessed the authority to bring order to the escalating situation, Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Shaw was an intimidating figure. He had been Chief Justice for 2 decades. Dana was 15 years old when Shaw became Chief Justice in 1830. The Chief Justice's chambers were in the courthouse, but Dana got only as far as the lobby. There he confronted Shaw, who had little interest in hearing from Dana. Dana quickly summarized his purpose as a case of an alleged fugitive slave, and my object is to test the constitutional power of the commissioner to issue a warrant. Shaw glanced at the petition and said, "This won't do. I can't do anything on this." Dana persisted. "I asked him to be so good as to tell me what the defects were." The Chief Justice replied, said Dana, in a most ungracious manner. In short, Dana wrote in his journal that evening, he attempted to bluff me off. There was no sure way to guarantee Dana's presence. Chief Justice Shaw said to Dana, "There's no evidence that it is on behalf of the prisoner. You have no evidence of authority. This was, of course, a direct affront to Dana because it implied he acted without the permission of his client. An angry Dana responded, "Do you require proof of authority, sir? What proof do you require?" Challenged, Shaw retreated to the last refuge of a Chief Justice, one I may have used once or twice. "It is enough for me to say that the position is not sufficient. There was," said Dana, "no mistaking the temper of the Chief Justice and his evident determination to get rid of me." Dana returned to his office. No sooner did he get there when he wrote, "I heard a shout from the courthouse, continued into a yell of triumph. African Americans had freed Shadrach." And wrote Dana, "They went off toward Cambridge like a black squall. 6 days later, Mencken was in Canada, beyond the grasp of the United States government." The escape precipitated a national crisis. President Fillmore convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet. Daniel Webster said he would resign within 24 hours if Fillmore did not use federal authority to arrest and prosecute any and all Bostonians alleged to have assisted in the escape. "No man in the cabinet stands up for the South in a manner more prompt than Mr. Webster," said a New Orleans newspaper. On February 18, 1851, Fillmore issued a proclamation calling on all citizens to assist in the recapture of a fugitive slave freed in Boston. The proclamation was written by Webster, and it said, "I do especially direct and command that prosecutions be commenced against all persons who have made themselves aiders or abettors, and I do further command that the U.S. Attorney cause such persons to be arrested." Arrests had already begun. Within 48 hours of the proclamation, 10 Bostonians, black and white, prominent and obscure, had been arrested for violating the fugitive slave law. The United States government was to spend the next 2 years prosecuting what became known as the rescue cases. Long after the Civil War, Adams was to write of Dana's defense of the accused. With a courage that was simply superb, he faced the law officers of the government and denounced them in measured terms that none could misunderstand. But all the 35-year-old Dana could know when he entered Boston's federal courthouse on the morning of February 20th, 1851, was that the U.S. government intended to prosecute all persons suspected of preventing the return of a man to slavery, and that Daniel Webster, the voice of the president and the Boston establishment, had ordered the prosecutions to begin. 72 hours after the proclamation, the U.S. attorney began proceedings against Charles Davis, the lawyer who had rushed into Dana's office to tell him of Shadrach's arrest. Dana represented Davis. As part of the government's case, the federal prosecutor introduced evidence that Davis had said to the deputy marshal who had arrested Shadrach, "You are engaged in a dirty business." Dana defended the remark. "I have said the same myself. I begged a man involved in slave catching to find honest work." The U.S. attorney was immediately on his feet. "A very improper remark." Dana replied, "I venture to suggest not." The judge interjected, "I see no distinction between attempting to deter men from executing the law and assisting in violating it." This was nothing less than putting Dana on notice that he was a prosecutorial target. The U.S. attorney asserted Mr. Dana might find himself changing places and be a defendant instead of counsel. Dana turned to the prosecutor and bowed. And then he delivered a withering retort to the judge's contention that the fugitive slave law compelled citizens to assist in seizing fugitive slaves. "No citizen is bound to an active execution of this law unless called upon as one of the posse comitatus. Did your honor feel bound to join in the pursuit of Shadrach last Saturday when the mob passed you at the corner of Court Street? Do you feel bound on a pleasant evening to walk about the neighborhood and see what fugitives you can dispose of? Would any compensation tempt you to do it?" Dana's cross-examination shredded the government's primary witness, and the judge dismissed the indictment. It was a stunning setback for the prosecution and for Webster. Determined to demonstrate to the South his zeal, Webster's agents seized a second fugitive slave from a Boston street less than 6 weeks later. This time the government took no chances. 23-year-old Thomas Sims was imprisoned in the Boston courthouse, filled with armed militia and literally encircled by heavy chains. Sims was transported back to Savannah, where he was whipped nearly to death in the public square. Webster triumphantly reported the news of the rendition to President Fillmore, who responded in kind. I congratulate you and the country on the triumph of law in Boston. She has wiped out the stain of the former rescue. Frederick Douglass had a different view. Daniel Webster has at last obtained from Boston a living sacrifice to appease the slave god of the American Union. Webster then turned back to the rescue cases, writing to President Fillmore that convictions were essential. The U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts began prosecutions intended to convict 3 leaders of Boston's African-American community, merchants James Scott, Lewis Hayden, and attorney Robert Morse. Each was charged with violating the law by aiding the escape of Shadrach Minkins. While Dana was defending James Scott, the Boston aristocracy broke off social relations with Dana. The Boston establishment called for a boycott of Dana's law practice. It is difficult to conceive of anything more disruptive to the concentration one needs to try a case before a jury than learning the community in which you live intends to ruin you. Mr. Dana ought to think he has had enough of it, wrote Webster. Webster used his immense stature as the country's most famous lawyer to press his cause. The act of taking away Shadrach was clear treason. I speak this in the hearing of men who are lawyers. I speak it out to the country. I say it everywhere on my professional reputation. It was treason and nothing less. By the fall of 1851, the U.S. Attorney in Boston had initiated prosecutions in 4 rescue cases. Dana was the defense lawyer in each case. There had not yet been a conviction. The charges against Charles Davis, the lawyer who rushed into Dana's office, had been dismissed. The trials of James Scott and Lewis Hayden had ended in hung juries. The 4th prosecution, begun the previous June against Robert Morris, had been continued over Dana's objection when the U.S. Attorney, George Lunt, realized the case was going badly for the government. Webster was irate at Lunt's performance. Lunt is not a good lawyer, he wrote to President Fillmore. To Lunt, Webster wrote, these cases are of the utmost importance. You must be fully aware of the consequences if just decisions should be failed to be obtained by want of skill. Webster then attempted to appoint Rufus Choate and Benjamin Curtis, Boston's most accomplished attorneys, as special prosecutors in the rescue cases. Curtis demurred because of his busy practice, as did Choate, though each said it would be an honor to represent the government in the rescue cases. But in September 1851, the death of a Supreme Court justice enabled Webster to make Benjamin Curtis a better offer. In one of the more remarkable letters of acceptance of a judicial appointment in the history of American law, Curtis wrote to Benjamin Fillmore, after returning from a business trip, I received from the Secretary of State a commission as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. After a perfunctory expression of thanks, Curtis advised the President to renew judicial circuit assignments, quote, as there is a trial in Boston at which my presence is very desirable. In the 19th century, Supreme Court justices could sit as trial judges. 3 days later, in November 1851, Curtis took office as the presiding judge in Boston's federal court in the case of the United States of America versus Robert Morris. There were 24,000 lawyers in the country. Robert Morris was the only one who was African American. Only 28, Morris was already a leader of Boston's African American community. He had joined with Charles Sumner in an unsuccessful attempt to persuade Chief Justice Shaw in the Massachusetts Supreme Court to end school segregation. The prosecution of Morris was particularly abhorrent because conviction would certainly lead to disbarment. Dana was appalled with the U.S. Attorney's treatment of Morris. In an exchange between Dana and the federal prosecutor, Dana said, when one by his industry and ability has raised himself to the dignity of a place in this bar, it was with mortification I heard him insulted as the little darky lawyer, and it was with deep regret I saw the representative of the United States lead the laughter against it. Dana's defense of Morris began with the argument that the initial warrant arresting Shadrach as a fugitive slave was void because there had been no finding that Shadrach was a descendant of slaves. It was exceedingly convenient for the prosecutor that the commissioner who issued the warrant was the judge's brother. Justice Curtis found the warrant valid. The proof that Shadrach was a slave came through the testimony of Virginia police officer John Caphart, who testified he had seen Shadrach sold in Richmond, Virginia. When Dana arose to question Officer Caphart, Dana later wrote, "Someone in the room gave me a hint of the occupation of some of these so-called policemen, which led to my cross-examination." And here I quote directly from the transcript and use language that I would not use if it was not in the transcript. Question: Mr. Caphart, do you flog slaves at the request of masters? Answer: certainly, when I'm called upon. Question: I suppose you flog women and girls as well as men? Answer: women and men. Question: Mr. Caphart, how long have you been engaged in this business? Answer: ever since 1836. Question: how many Negroes do you suppose you flogged in all, women and children included? Answer: I don't know how many niggers you've got here in Massachusetts, but I think I have flogged as many as you've got in this state. On November 11th, 1851, Justice Curtis charged the jury. In the brightly rendered version of history, we remember Justice Curtis for his dissent in Dred Scott. And so, as white Americans, we would naturally assume, as did I, that in a case in which the government's chief witness deliberately used the N-word to intimidate the only African-American lawyer in the country, Justice Curtis would have admonished the witness, the prosecutor, and advised the jury of the impropriety of the remark. Here is Justice Curtis's charge. As to Mr. Caphart, the law provides rules. One is that a witness under oath is to be believed unless his testimony is impeached. Was there anything to impugn Mr. Caphart's character for truth or veracity? It has been argued that his statements as to his relation with the colored population should have that effect. A witness, a stranger among us, must be treated with fairness and not overwhelmed by tempestuous sensibilities. The jury received the case at 2:30 p.m. At 9:30 a.m. the next morning, they announced they had a verdict. This was not welcome news. The trials of James Scott and Lewis Hayden were victories for the defense because the juries could not reach a verdict. Unanimity was not a good sign for Morris. The tension for the 28-year-old Morris and Dana, who was only 7 years older, must have been unbelievable. Have you reached a verdict? Asked the clerk. We have, answered the foreman. What say you? Not guilty. Now, I've done a number of readings since this book was published in 2015 with exchange and story in mind. It never occurred to me in the first 2 years, as it surely does now, how even my story is brightly rendered. It falls exactly into Ta-Nehisi Coates' description of how white Americans comfortably deal with uncomfortable history. Quote, in America, every success story is almost always rendered in the singular action of exceptional individuals. There is always some passing acknowledgement of the bad old days, which, by the way, were not so bad as to have any effect on the present. But of course, as Faulkner said, the past is always present. It is not even past. When Charles Francis Adams, 10 years after Dana's death, completed his Dana biography, he said of the pro-slavery sentiments of the Boston establishment that attempted to crush Dana, they are almost forgotten, and in a few more years, he who speaks the truth about them will be denounced as a maligner. In 2019, denouncement of maligners is the most valuable coin in politics. It's a distressing time. But I don't think the future belongs to the maligners, so I will give the final word to someone to whom the future does belong, my youngest daughter, our youngest daughter, Nancy. She's a better writer than I am, which is why I asked her to co-write a TV pilot script based on Slavish shore. As part of that process, Nancy was asked why she thought it was a story worth telling. Here was her response. Since Slavish Shore's publication in 2015, my father and I have worked to bring Dana's story to life. As the political and social climate shifted, we pursued the project with increased urgency. Our neglected and ugly history has come to collect its debt. The leadership we were once told to look at as a model of values and morality is broken. We may need fiction to escape, but we need fact to reconcile our past and present, as all of us surely know. Thank you.